The next major threat to biodiversity that we're going to talk about are invasive species. So what is that? They are non-native species that is sufficiently competitive that it affects native species. So if it's a non-native species and it's not really having much effect on the ecosystem or native species, that is not usually considered invasive. They also, because the sufficiently competitive part usually means that they're good at expanding, so they can kind of take over an area is very common in invasive species. A related term is an exotic species. We might also say a non-native species. This is any species occurring outside of its native range. This isn't necessarily near the edge of their native range and they're moving by themselves. This is usually things that people have introduced. So there are, I guess a good example are ornamental plants. If they don't take over, they're not really in native ecosystems, they're just in people's yards or in landscaping, those might be considered exotic species, but they're not invasive because they're not taking over, they're not affecting native species. So those are important distinction to remember. Less than 1% of exotic species actually become invasive. So we have lots of things that we plant all over the place that are not native to our area, but they don't go and take over other ecosystems. When invasive species dominate, native biodiversity tends to decline. And that's typically a hallmark of invasive species. They take over so much that there's not as much space or resources for native species. So where do invasive species come from? A lot of them have been deliberate introductions by Europeans and wildlife managers. So that includes things like domestic cats, ringneck pheasants, common starlings, were all introduced on purpose by people. Things that have escaped. These are usually things that have escaped from agriculture, horticulture, or aquaculture. And so examples of this are buckthorn, Eurasian water milfoil is a common aquarium plant that people dump their aquariums in bodies of water thinking it's no big deal, but then those plants can take over. Another big category is accidental transport. So an example of this is like zebra mussels. Certain aquatic organisms attach themselves to boats. Boats drive from one place to another, and they bring those organisms with them. If they drop off in the new location, they might become established and take over, and we get invasive species that way. We also get things like stowaways on planes. I'll talk about an example where there were snakes in cargo, and they totally invaded some islands. But there are lots of examples of that where we accidentally have things that stow away in trucks or boats. If they're microorganisms, they could even hitch a ride on the bottoms of our shoes kind of thing. And then we fly to another country and we're bringing organisms with us. Another one is another deliberate type of introduction, and that's for biological control. And so sometimes when one thing is getting out of hand, we'll introduce their predator or their consumer to help control that. And sometimes those start growing like crazy and get out of hand. So an example of this is carp. We've introduced them to control some plants in water, and they've gotten totally out of hand and become invasive themselves. So I want you to think for a second, what are some invasive species that occur around here? I'm pretty sure anybody can think of some. Here are some examples that I came up with. You may have come up with some other ones that I didn't include here. So probably ones people think about the most are fire ants. Fire ants are from South America. They don't belong here. They're super annoying, and nobody likes to get bit by fire ants. And they kind of take over, have giant nests. So that's an example of an invasive species. Feral hogs. Hogs are not native to most of the United States. There is a collared peccaries that are from Mexico and live in the southwest of the United States, but they're not really supposed to be here or in the eastern United States. These are domesticated pigs that have been released and become feral out in the wild that are a European species. Hydrilla, that's one of those aquarium plants that people have dumped out and can take over waterways. I've started doing research on mosquitoes in my lab, and I put out buckets with different kinds of leaves to see if different species of mosquitoes would preferentially lay eggs in pools with different types of leaves in them. But interestingly, the dominant mosquito that I was finding, and I just did this experiment in the spring, is Asian tiger mosquitoes. And this is a mosquito that carries quite a few pathogens. It can carry Zika, but it won't carry it if it's not already in the population. But these can spread diseases. And so this is one example of an invasive species that we have a lot of in Ruston. Another one is winter creeper. These two plants are kind of my personal foes. My backyard is completely covered in winter creeper. It's planted all over campus. But it just takes over, and it's called winter creeper because it keeps growing in the winter, and you can mow over it and the roots stay there and then put up new leaves, and usually it builds stronger roots if you cut off the tops. So it's really, really hard to get rid of. This is Chinese tallow. It's also all over town. It's really easy to see in the winter because it has these white fruiting bodies that are waxy. And so it's sometimes called the popcorn tree because these little white berries look like popcorn. So if you see a tree with lots of white berries, that's it. Also in the fall, the leaves turn this really bright orange color. But it has this characteristic shape that none of our other tree leaves have this exact shape. We have some things that make more of a heart shape, but none of them come out on both ends like this does. And the leaves from this are very toxic. They can kill tadpoles very, very quickly. And we've been doing some research on Chinese tallow in my lab as well. So how does invasive species affect biodiversity? And what are some characteristics of invasive species? So you probably can think about this yourself and come up with answers to both of these things. So we'll start with characteristics of invasive species. What do you think? What are some things that might make a species more successful in a new habitat? And you can pause if you want to think about this for a second. So these are some of the ones that scientists have come up with. They're good dispersers, which means they can move easily. For plants, a lot of times that means that they're wind dispersed. So an example is dandelions. So you see as the seeds start to let go from the flower, the wind catches them and they can go really far because they're adapted for this wind dispersal. Things that have high reproduction, typically if they have many small offspring, they're more likely to be invasive because they can take over very quickly if those offspring do well. They have fast growth. They tend to be a habitat generalist, which again means that they can deal with lots of different kinds of ecosystems and live there. If you're a specialist and require very particular resources, it might be harder to spread because those resources might not be all over the place. Things that have asexual reproduction tend to do really well because when you get to a new area, you don't need to find a mate. You can start breeding right away. And so some plants can do that. Some lizards can do that. That makes it much easier for them to be invasive. Things that are good at dealing with disturbed areas and coexisting with humans are more likely to be invasive as well because as we change habitats and alter the landscape, there's more spaces where these invasive species can take hold. The second question, which has been asked by a lot of scientists, is, do invasive species cause native species to go extinct? And there's some mixed information on this, but definitely they can, but only in particular circumstances. If they are predators, the answer is yes, especially on islands. Almost all of the cases of native species going extinct from invasive species has come from predators that were introduced to islands, and we'll go through some examples of this in a minute. If they're just competitors, it's possible, but there's not much clear evidence that this happens on a regular basis. There are lots of examples of predation on islands causing native species to go extinct. And the actual impact of invasive species on natives is somewhat controversial, and so you can see this here. These papers are a little bit older, but you can see asking, are invasive species a major cause of extinction? And then down here, invasive species are a leading cause of animal extinctions. And so you can see that this has been debated in the scientific literature. But I do want you to remember that they definitely can cause extinction through predation on islands. And so this is probably the most famous example. I mentioned that there was a snake that stowed away in some cargo. So Guam is an island in the Pacific Ocean that's owned by the United States. And what happened was there was a plane with some shipping cargo, and a snake had gotten into a shipping cargo box. You know, you leave things sitting for a while, and sometimes animals get into them. So this is a snake that's native to Australia, the brown tree snake. And it got into a shipping container in the 1950s, and it got off on our military base in Guam. And it now occurs in densities of up to 40 per acre. So I have a kind of average size or a slightly large backyard. My backyard is about 0.4 acres. So if you can think of two kind of medium size, 2.5 medium size backyards and front yards, lots with houses on them, with 40 of these brown tree snakes on them. That is a lot of snakes. I can tell you right now, of all the species of snakes, there are not 40 in my neighborhood per acre. So this is an extremely high density of snakes, particularly of one species. One of the reasons it was so problematic is that a lot of these remote Pacific islands don't have any snakes on them. So that was the case for Guam. There were no snakes on this island, and so none of the species on the island knew how to deal with a snake predator. They didn't have any adaptations that protected them from a snake predator. So this brown tree snake, you know, snakes often will eat, there's some specialists, but a lot of snakes, a lot of reptiles and amphibians in general, eat whatever fits in their mouth. And so these snakes just ate birds and lizards like crazy. They've been trying to control them, and it's been really, really difficult. And so this helicopter is showing they're dropping a dead mouse with some medicine in it that is lethal to the snakes. And so the snakes will eat the dead mice and die. And so that's been a little bit effective, but it hasn't been effective enough to really control them well. So the effects of the brown tree snake. I said that the only way we know for sure that invasive species cause extinctions, that doesn't mean that invasive species don't affect species other ways, but they definitely cause extinctions if they're predators on islands. So this is one of the top examples of that. So the brown tree snake caused the loss of all breeding seabird populations on Guam. 10 out of 13 native forest birds went extinct, 2 out of 3 native mammals went extinct, and 6 out of 10 native lizards went extinct. That is insane. That is a lot. And so this is some examples of those birds. And you can see all of these have gone extinct. All right, another example is the cane toad. So it's been introduced to a lot of different islands. It is native to Central and South America. And toads have these very large poison glands. And these are the largest toads in the world. And you can see I'm highlighting with my cursor the poison glands. So this big pocket right here is filled with poison. So if a predator bites down on them, they get a mouthful of poison. And there are no toads native to Australia and some of these other islands. This has been introduced in southern Florida, but we do have native toads in Florida. So our predators in the United States are a little bit more familiar with toads and how distasteful they are. But they basically get a mouthful of poison, and it's often lethal to any predator that tries to eat it. And they don't move very fast, so they look like easy prey. So a lot of these predators will be like, oh, look, an easy meal. And it's a giant toad that looks like a great thing to eat. And they bite into it, and then they get this toxin, and they die. And so this is happening all over the place. They introduced cane toads to deal with the cane worm. So they're called cane toads because in theory they eat cane worms, which attack sugar cane plants. And so in Australia they were having huge problems growing sugar with these cane worms. So they introduced cane toads to try and control them. And then when they got there, they didn't even eat the cane worms. So major mistake. And basically everywhere cane toads have been introduced are places where sugar is grown. And so in Australia, it's been a huge problem. I said there are no native toads in Australia. This is a kind of a zoomed up picture of the parotid gland, which is where the poison is. And a lot of animals have been harmed by this. So this is a monitor lizard, and this is a quoll. They think that these are easy meals, and it's not gone very well. The toads have been rapidly spreading across Australia, and so this map, it's a little small, but it shows that where they've been. So this is where sugar is grown, this area in Queensland, Australia, which I visited before, and they were introduced in the 1930s. And they've been spreading all the way across, and they've made it to a lot of other parts of the coastline. It's very dry in the interior of Australia, so they don't do well there, but they are doing well along the coastlines. And interestingly, we've seen evolution, and we see that there are different characteristics of the toads in different parts of their range. And a scientist that I know, Rick Shine, his lab has been responsible for this research, but they find that on the leading edge, so the places where the toads are expanding into new areas, they have longer legs and they have higher propensity to disperse, whereas in the interior where they've been there a long time, they have much shorter legs. So we're seeing evolution in these invasive species when they're in new habitats. All right, in Florida, when you think of invasive species in the United States, you often think of Florida. A lot of them come in through the shipping port in Miami, and these are amphibians and reptiles. There are birds and mammals and other things. These were the things that came to mind for me. So there's cane toads, but there's also iguanas and tegu lizards, which apparently have now made it all the way up to South Carolina. This is a type of monitor lizard, and this is the Burmese python. But they have all kinds of things that have all come in through Miami.